Hello, I'm Michael Hackney, and in today's KISSlicer 1.6 tutorial, we're going to be looking at parameters and loops. Parameters define the boundary for each layer of your sliced part. And when the layers are stacked on top of each other, which we can see here, the parameters form the vertical and sloped walls that you see when you pick up the part. A lot of people on the forums and news groups and Facebook and other places, complain about having little blobs of plastic, or sometimes called warts, or having strings appear on the parameters when they're printing. That really detracts from the appearance of the final part. And what we're going to do is learn about some of KISSlicer's capabilities and features that will help you minimize or actually even eliminate those types of defects on your printed parts. So let's take a look at the first layer, and I'll go into the Paths view and scroll down to the very first layer. Scroll up here, and before we get started, just a couple of comments. I've basically disabled all of the advanced features at this point. I want to show you what a typical first layer looks like so we can kind of get a feel for how a slicer works and how a particular sliced set of G-code is going to be printed on your printer. Then we'll go through and we'll look at each of the features and see how they affect, in particular, the parameters, because that's the area that is exposed and is most problematic for folks. So here we are at the first layer. I'm going to use the path percent, and I'm going to scroll all the way to the left to simulate the way the printer would print this part. And so we can see this light blue trace, which in KISSlicer, if we go up to the Health Info menu, we get a color key. We see that light blue is a perimeter path. So that's the one that you can see on the outside of the part. Let's scroll it a little bit further, and right there where the perimeter ended, at the point where it began, is what all the hoopla is about. Now, that's where the problems occur. And so you can see if the printer had a little bit of extra pressure in the nozzle when it stopped there and then moved over to start printing the inner loops, that little blob is going to appear and form a little lump or a little wart or zit, some people call them, right at that point. And then also, if the nozzle is moving some distance, like maybe from this part of the geometry over to another part to print, say, an internal hole feature or something, that could draw a thin filament or a string. And that's not good. We can continue kind of drawing this around. You can see each of the loops. We've got one perimeter and two loops in this case, and then all the infill is printed. You don't see typically all of this stuff on the inside of a part, and so if you have a few defects or blobs or strings inside it here, it's usually not a problem. It's the ones on the perimeter and the ones on the top and bottom surfaces, shell layers, that are the problem. So let's take a look at a couple of features first. We slice this part in what's called perimeter first order. So what that meant is it printed the perimeter first, and then it printed the inner loops, and then printed the infills. On many slicers, this is called outside in, and it's a good way to print a part. It does result in better geometric tolerance. You get a more precise part. But because you're starting on the outside of the part, if there's any extra pressure in the hot end, so you get a little bit of extra plastic coming out of the nozzle, it is going to show up as a problem, wart or a string on your part. The other option, and all slicers that I'm aware of has this option, is called perimeter last or inside out. And what that means is the slicer will actually lay out and print the innermost loops first, and then print the outermost or the perimeter last. And we can see that here. I'll scroll all the way over. And we can see there we're printing a loop. We've finished the innermost loop. Now we're printing the second loop, and then we're starting to print the perimeter. And we'll come back around, and there it is. The printer has completed the perimeter, and we've finished. In general, this results in a better appearance of your part, a better surface quality, because there's not as much starting and stopping, and not as much opportunity for pressure inside of the nozzle to push out a little bit of extra plastic to create a wart or a little bit of extra plastic that's going to result in a string. However, because you've actually started printing inside of the part, these layers, these perimeters or loops, as they expand a little bit, do result in a slight decrease in overall precision of the geometry of the part. And so there's a bit of a trade-off between perimeter last and loop last that you have to make and use when you're printing. Okay, so that's perimeter last and loop, then perimeter last, perimeter first. KISSlicer 1.6 has this new feature called Loop 1 before perimeter. And this is a really cool feature, and in fact, it is now my default case. And I'll show you how it works. So we'll slice apart, go down, look at the first layer, and we'll scroll the path all the way across, and we see it's actually started to print the first inside loop, then it hops out a little bit and prints the perimeter, and then it comes back and prints the final loop. So this option, the first loop before perimeter, is a good trade-off between precision of the part and quality, surface quality of the part. And it works remarkably well, so I just leave that as my default setting. So that's the loop order and how that works on your part. I'm going to switch back to perimeter first so we can look at some of these other options. Okay, next up I want to look at seam gap. And seam gap is exactly what it sounds like. If seam gap is 0, like it is right now, the default case, where that seam begins, or the perimeter begins, and where it ends, there's no gap in between it. If I increase the seam gap, say to 4, which is the largest value that it'll take, there'll be a gap between the starting and the ending point. And what that does is allow any extra plastic that might have formed to kind of fill into that gap and not create a blob, or ultimately not create a string. And so let's see what that looks like. I'm going to scroll this up to 4, and I'm going to slice, and then we'll take a look. Now the first thing to keep in mind, this is not in millimeters. A seam gap of 4 is relative to the extrusion width of your particular slice. So our extrusion width right now is 0.4 millimeters, so a seam gap of 4 is relative to that. And KISSlicer does that for, I think, a really cool reason. And that is, if I change nozzles and increase or decrease my extrusion width, say to 0.6 millimeters with a 0.6 millimeter nozzle, the seam gap, if you leave it the same, you'll get the same relative gap for the width of the extrusion, so you don't have to go back and retune your seam gap for every nozzle that you're using to slice your parts. So it really helps kind of sort of normalize everything so you have a consistent starting point. Okay, so here we are. We've got a seam gap of 4. We're printing outermost perimeter first, and there we see it right there. There's a gaping gap. And in fact, that gap is so big that if I printed this on any of my printers and looked at the surface of the part, you would literally see a big void, which is actually another potential defect that you'll see. A big void in the surface of the part and really detract from its appearance. And then just to show you what it looks like with a smaller gap, we'll reduce that down to 2. And scroll down, and now you see that the gap has gotten smaller. Okay, so let's move this back up to 4 and slice it so we can see what that big gap looks like. There it is. And now let's talk about seam depth. And this is one of the most, I think, important and interesting features of KISSlicer. I'm going to increase seam depth all the way up to 1, and I'm going to slice. Again, the seam depth is not in millimeters. It is also relative to the extrusion width, for the same reason that seam gap is relative. And here it is. We've got our big gap. But notice what happened here on the perimeter. There's this little jut. So it actually starts printing a little bit inside of the perimeter, inside of the part, moves out, and then it's going to go all the way around the part, print the perimeter, and then when it comes back, it doesn't just stop and either stop at a butt or stop with a gap. The printer nozzle is going to come back inside the part a little bit, so you get kind of this crossing effect at the beginning and the start. And this is an exaggerated case because remember, we have a gap of 4. So what this really does is going to start to hide that gap. And also, it's going to move any extra plastic that might have formed in the case of a blob inside the part where it's not going to be visible. So let's take a look at what this does if we move seam gap down to 1, leave seam depth at 1, and we'll slice and take a look at the first layer. And here we go. And there you can see it. I'm going to zoom in so you can really see this. A little crossover. So the printer's going to start printing right here on the inside of the part a little bit. It's going to move out to where the perimeter is. It's going to go all the way around the perimeter. It's going to come back, and then rather than just stop here and potentially leave a blob, which could then create a string, it's going to cut back into the part a little bit, forming that little cross. One of the most useful and important features in KISSlicer, and it's been there for as long as I can remember. Maybe it was in the release 1 version of KISS. And it is one of the many reasons why I've been saying all along that KISSlicer's G-code paths are some of the most advanced and useful of any slicer around. So that's the seam depth and seam gap. In practice, I typically leave my seam depth at 1, as you see here. And for my Delta printers, the gap is generally around 0.5. And we'll see what that looks like here. And this is something that you can kind of experiment with. What I recommend is using a single layer model, and I've got one up on my blog. It's a 50 millimeter diameter disc. It'll be printed in 1 layer height, so it'll be 0.2 millimeters thick. You should use 3 or 4 loops, so you get plenty of loops out here so you can see what's going on. And when you print it, you can then peel it off, and they print very quickly, which is why I do it. You can peel it off, and you can look, if you have good eyes, you can look at the seam from both the top and the bottom, as well as from the edge, or use a magnifying glass, is what I do, and take a look at it, and you'll see exactly what that crossover looks like, and you'll see if you've got any little voids or if there's too much plastic in there, and then you can come down and start to experiment, probably with your seam gap more than seam depth, with your seam gap until you get it just right. And then from that point forward, you should have some pretty nice looking perimeters on your printed parts. So that's seam depth and seam gap. And the next thing I want to talk about is this feature called join loop. And when I click on that, we see that there are 3 options. There's off, seam, and full. I'm going to choose the full join loop option first because I think that one's the easiest to visualize. I'll click that. And I'll go up here and I'll slice. And we'll scroll down to take a look at the part. And now we see something interesting. We see 2 perimeters. Remember, light blue is perimeter. What's going on? If we scroll all the way across on the path percent, we see that this perimeter is actually, let's use the arrow keys, is starting to print on the inside of the part a little bit. And now as it comes back around, back around, it doesn't stop. It continues on, it crosses over and continues on around, and then finally, when it gets back to the other side, it stops right there in one continuous double loop around with 1 seam. So you basically have 1 starting point and 1 ending point. And it's on the inside of your part where you're not going to see it, and it's not going to create a blob and not going to create a string that can cause problems. And you get 2 perimeters with 1 start and stop point. Really powerful feature. Let's take a look at what seam does. Slice. Let's scroll down. Now we see it's kind of a hybrid. We're not actually printing a complete second loop, but it looks like what the printer has done is started inside the part a little bit. It started printing part of this internal loop, then it migrates out and prints the perimeter, and it comes all the way back around, crosses over and inside, and then starts the second loop in. And we can take a look at that by sliding the path percent all the way across. And sure enough, that's exactly what's going on. Printer comes across, crosses back inward, and starts the second loop, and then when it gets back around, that second loop is going to end where the perimeter started here. Now, again, it's moved the start and stop points completely inside of the part, on this first loop inside the interior. But unlike the full option, we actually have two start and stop points. We have this start and stop point where the perimeter first started, came all the way around, and then ended here. And then when the inner loop starts, we've got its start point here, and then comes around and ends here. However, both of those start-stop points are inside of the part where they're out of eye's way or harm's way, and consequently can result in a much better surface area finish. Again, the main difference really is perimeters you can print at a different print speed. Notice down here, and I did a video that I posted yesterday, actually, a tutorial on print speeds, on speed settings in KISS. And you notice that my perimeters are being printed at 30 millimeters a second, whereas my loops are being printed at 60 millimeters a second. And I go into detail about why I do that. But if I were printing both, if I were using the full option, so I had two perimeters here, I'd basically be printing two outer loops or perimeters at 30 millimeters per second, which would be, pretty slow. By using the seam option, I can print the outermost at 30 millimeters a second, and then the inner one I can speed up at 60 millimeters a second. So it's a good compromise. It gives me the benefits of a full join loop, meaning that the starting and stop points are inside of the part where they're not going to create a visual artifact or defect on my part. But yet I get reasonably fast print speeds because only the outermost perimeter is being printed slowly and all of the loops inside are being printed more quickly. So my default now with this new feature is to leave it at seam all the time unless I run into a special part and I need to make some special changes to handle it. But for the most part, I just leave everything on seam. So here we have really my default settings. Perimeter last, loop before perimeter. Let's take a slice of that. You'll see it really looks the same. Scroll down. Yep, loop before perimeter, but because we are doing seam join loop, it's going to print that loop first, and then it's going to print the perimeter and come back around. So I get even more of the benefit of moving the start and stop points inside the part, and I'm getting the benefit of doing an inner loop first to let everything in the system, the extruder and the hot end, sort of get up to equilibrate. So it's printing along smoothly, and then can just continue on and smoothly print the perimeter without any blobbing or gaps or any other problems. So loop 1 before perimeter, seam depth of 1, seam gap of 0.5, and you can experiment with that. And join loop I use a seam. The last thing on this seam hiding box that you can see is a little checkbox called corners. And actually when you look at the tooltip, what it says is it places a seam on a corner when available. And this is kind of an interesting thing to think about if you haven't. When I'm looking at a part like this, and let's go ahead and look at a number of layers and scroll up. When you're looking at a part like this, it's these large flat wall surfaces that you see, and that's where any little defect is highly visible. If you can put the beginning and start points in a corner, like either on an outside corner or on an inside corner, they're less visible, less problematic there. The eye isn't attracted to them as much as it is if they're on a flat surface like this. So even a tiny defect on a big flat surface is going to be highly visible and distracting, whereas a defect in a corner or on a corner is not going to be nearly as distracting. So that's what that corner checkbox does. While we're here, let's take a look at one last thing, and that is this angle setting and jitter setting. And you notice I've got my angle set straight up, so it's a 12 o'clock position, and you notice that my jitter is set to 0 degrees. So if you look straight up, right there is the beginning and ending of every perimeter for all of the slices that I did for the demo so far. And that's what this angle does. So if I move the angle over to the left by 30 degrees and I slice, or maybe that's 45 degrees, and then let's take a look at the first layer, we'll see that now my start and end point are over here, aligned with where I set that angle. What the jitter does, and let's set this back, what the jitter does is defines how far to the left or the right in degrees the slicer can start or stop the endpoint of a path or of a perimeter. And so, for instance, since I have jitter set to 0, it's always going to start and stop at the same point. We're not letting the slicer have any flexibility at all about where it can put the start and the ending point of my parameters. It's got to start and end at the same place. So by increasing the jitter, say, to 25 degrees, and you can see what it's done, those red lines show you sort of the range of angles that KISS will randomly put the start and stop points on each layer. There's 50 degrees. I see that my angle is not quite aligned, so I'm going to line this up at the 12-degree position. And you can see now that I am constraining my start and stop points on the perimeters to just this feature, which is the handle feature of a gas grill knob on that back surface randomly, so they potentially won't be visually distracting. I can create a 360-degree randomization simply by entering 360 in jitter, and now you can see that this gives KISSlicer basically free reign over where it begins and each perimeter on each layer, and can completely randomize it around the part. So you can use this feature, both the angle, let's go back down to 0. You can use this feature, the angle, to position where you would like to constrain the start and stop points, and then you can use the jitter to relax that a little bit and let KISS randomize it within the angular degrees that you've set here. So really kind of convenient way of giving KISS hints about where you would like to start and stop your perimeter lines and how far it can go to randomize the beginnings and ends. Let's go back down to 0 here. Set this back up to 12 o'clock. There we go. And let's take a look at one more thing on the Materials tab. There are some features in the Materials tab that are actually part of the materials because they change greatly depending on the type of filament you're printing. PLA, for instance, is different than ABS, different than PETG or TPU or nylon. And so it makes sense to have those types of features here. D-string is what most slicers call retract, and I'm not going to go into D-string right now. In fact, let's go ahead and just set that 0. And we'll have a tutorial dedicated to advanced features like D-string and preload soon. The one I want to talk about is wipe, and I'm pretty confident that all of the major slicers that I've seen and used support a wipe feature. And what it basically is when the slicer generates the path, it starts the perimeter. The perimeter comes back around and it joins, or if there's a gap or crossover, it does its little magic there. But rather than just stopping, what will actually happen, the the extruder will come in, it'll stop, and then it'll backtrack over itself some number of millimeters, and that's what you're setting here, a number of millimeters, backtrack over itself to basically wipe the tip of the nozzle. So if there's any blob of plastic, that'll be spread out back over the filament that you just printed, where it probably will not be visually distracting. So if we actually put down a wipe of, say, 2 millimeters, and we come in here and we slice this part, and scroll down to take a look at that first layer again, we now see these orange segments, and in KISSlicer, the path color key, we see that orange is a wipe path. And let's scroll the path percentage all the way across so we can see we've started printing the innermost loop first. That's my favorite option. It comes around and it moves outward to print the perimeter. And now the perimeter comes around and finishes up the loop. And then rather than stopping right here where the inner loop began, it actually backtracks back over itself 2 millimeters for this wipe. Now, in this case, it's actually backtracking far enough that a little bit of the wipe is actually occurring on the outside of the part. And potentially that could be problematic. If there's a lot of extra, filament blob or something, it could maybe migrate all the way out here as part of the wipe. So I like to keep my wipes down around 1 millimeter or so, 4.4 millimeter nozzle. So let's take a look at what that looks like, and here it is. You can see I've reduced it by, well, half, from 2 millimeters to 1 millimeter, and now my wipe is happening on the inside, completely out of the way, and will most likely not contribute to any blobbing or stringing on the outside of the part. One thing you might have noticed, when I changed this wipe parameter, let's change it back to 3, I didn't have to reslice. KISSlicer automatically makes the adjustment because it's already done all the path layout, and wipe only affects the the final layout when it generates the G-code. So you can actually come in here and play around with your wipe settings. You can see I just changed it up to 5, and without having to reslice the part and take up a lot of time. So if I go down to 1, I can see it's reduced itself. If I go to 0.5, even more so. But so you can kind of then tune it visually on screen, getting it to sort of how you want it to wipe for your part, and you'll be all set. So let's change this back to 1, and there we go. That's my favorite wipe. So that's the wipe setting and how it can work with some of the perimeter and loop settings on the style dialog. And that's about it. So using these features, you can, especially if you do a little practicing, and I would recommend that, after you've seen this video the first time, open up KISSlicer, load my simple 50 millimeter diameter single layer test part, and slice it and print it. And go through the video and do each of these. Do the perimeter first, perimeter last, and loop 1, and print one of these single layer parts for each one, and peel it off your bed and take a look at it and see what effect does that have on the part. Did it leave a little blob? Did it string? Or does it look great? And by doing that and then tuning your seam depth and your seam gap, and then ultimately your wipe distance here, you can start to get some very nice outer surfaces without blobbing and without stringing or completely eliminating or minimizing greatly. There are some geometries that can be more challenging, particularly if there are lots of small features that the printer has to print and then jump to another one and then jump to another one. Those are the places where you get the little blobs and strings. And these seam depth, seam gap, wipe, and ultimately when we talk about preload and retract, will help mitigate those more complicated cases. But for now, take a look at these, practice with them, at least practice with them in the slicer so you can see what they look like and start to get a feel for the G-code and understand how the printer is going to print this G-code by using the path slider. And you'll be really far, far along the curve in terms of learning how to slice parts that will print beautiful quality parts. And that's it for now. Thank you very much for watching.